Hey, what's going on, Your Zen Life? I'm here with my friend Qui Alexander, and we're going to have a conversation today about transformative justice and how this affects certain communities and how it plays into specifically and comes from the LGTBQ community. But before that, Qui, would you be interested in introducing yourself?
Hey y'all, my name is Key. My pronouns are they, them, and I'm currently based in Minneapolis, Minnesota.
Awesome. So we've had some off-recorded moments talking about this, and maybe we should bring everyone up to snuff. I was put in touch with you through our shared friend, Brooke, and the abolition work that she's doing, and we're kind of working on together. But then we got hip to talking about transformative justice and how that maybe exists within the cosmos of the abolition movement, but it is not specifically maybe directly rooted, or maybe you could help me explore this.
hmm Yeah, so I think of transformative justice as a larger framework of thinking about how we can address harm in our communities without causing more harm,
Mm-hmm.
right? And so I often think that right now, like how our society responds to any type of harm or violence is punitive, right? It's like you do something wrong, you get punished for it, with the hope that that punishment might deter you from doing something in the future, right? But what that does is that, often that's done by shame, often that's done in ways that also harm other people. And so, anytime we use the justice system and Black and brown people are getting locked up, that's also enacting more harm to them and their communities, right? They're missing members of the communities, things like that. So I always think of transformative justice as a way to think about how can we address harm, but also transform the conditions that cause the harm in the first place, right? So often, which feels different for me than say restorative justice,
Mm-hmm.
which I think is often, involving the people who caused harm and the people who received harm and figuring out, being in conversation and figuring out what can that person do to be accountable to that harm. But oftentimes, what is missing is that we try to restore to something that was already imbalanced,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
And so when we talk about transformative justice, we're also talking about attacking the root conditions that cause poverty, homelessness,
Mm-hmm.
food insecurity, those types of things. And we change those conditions, we also change the community so that harm doesn't happen again.
Incredible. Yeah. You've said so many things that I've said like, okay, keep note of that, mention that, keep note of that, mention that. This idea of immediately brings to mind when people throw around language about the system's broken, the system's broken. This is, in my opinion, a bit of a misdirection insofar as the system was designed to do what it's doing. And actually, for a certain portion of the community in the world, it's working quite well. How would that land if I were to say that?
Yeah, I definitely agree. We have a system in our country that is based on indigenous genocide and the enslavement of Black people. And if we don't come to reckons about the implications of that, both, ideologically, materially, and spiritually,
Mm-hmm.
then we're never really going to address these things. And those are the ideologies and worldviews that are underneath all these systems. So I would agree that these systems are designed to exploit people, are designed to oppress people, and they're working quite well, like you said, for very few. And so, yeah, I think, when that conversation about abolition comes, it's people get scared because they're like, oh, you're saying that we just get rid of everything? Then what are we going to do? Can't this be fixed? But when you have something that's rooted in such violence, both materially and spiritually, with that, that it's not that can never be improved.
Mm-hmm.
That can only work to, capitalism is always designed to exploit somebody.
Mm-hmm.
And so those things can't necessarily be tweaked. They have to be kind of grabbed at the root, uprooted, and designed completely new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because I think when it gets to just the hashtag of defund the police, this could be very frightening for people. And
Mm-hmm.
more so, I would say specifically, very frightening to people who probably don't have any other experience than gratitude when they call the police, right?
Absolutely.
So coming to awareness of the gratitude that I have may be indicative of the other side of the oppression that's leveraged against people by the police. So maybe a little bit about the history of policing, because I don't think a lot of people in America really understand where specifically policing as a concept came from. We've sort of grown up thinking,
Mm-hmm.
oh, there's always the police and it's always been a benevolent system. Could you speak about that a
Mm-hmm.
little?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think, we often are given the narrative that police are civil servants. And so that is something that we kind of gravitate to, right? This kind of benevolence, these folks are here to protect us. But the reality is that policing came out of the institution of slave catching. And so they were literally folks to catch runaway slaves and to control those folks. And then after slavery was abolished, where the groups of folks that were used to basically protect property and property rights. And so ultimately, the police and our law system are not actually created to support and protect individuals, but rather to protect private property. And some folks have access to private property in ways that other folks in other communities do not in this country. So I think policing for many Black and Brown communities have been about surveillance, have been about harassment, have been around intimidation, policing communities doesn't necessarily make them safer. We see that some of the most safest communities are communities that are well resourced, right? That means that people in their communities have access to food, have access to housing, have access to quality education, have access to jobs and employment, access to healthcare. If our communities had those things, those are the things that actually would make our communities safer. And so I think people are attached to this idea of like, we have to have some type of law enforcement. And when they hear defund the police, they hear like, okay, so nobody's going to enforce the law. And when abolitionists are asking for that, that's not what they're saying. They're not saying, cool, we're just going to have nobody to rely on. We're saying that we actually get to create different systems to actually respond to the various issues that police respond to, right? So the majority of issues are things that, police aren't actually properly trained with to deal with anyways, right? But we live in a culture that says any type of problem you have, you pick up 911, right? And so, if people are having a mental health crisis, what would it look like if we actually had people you could call when someone was in distress that was trained in de-escalation and could actually support someone through that moment, rather than criminalizing their behavior and then using it as an excuse to place harm about them because you felt threatened, right? So there is this thing that happens, I think the other thing that is really real is when we think about some of the most horrendous crimes that we have in our society, our current system doesn't actually address those things either, right? So when we think about, I hear when people say, if we get rid of prisons, what do we do with the murderers? And what do we do with the rapists? And what do we do with the pedophiles? Like these very grave things. And those are important questions to ask. But the reality is our current system isn't actually addressing those folks. The majority of people who enact sexual harm are not actually incarcerated.
That's correct.
The majority of people who are incarcerated in this country are people who are incarcerated on nonviolent drug offenses, right? If incarceration was something that led to safety, we would be the safest country in the world because we incarcerate more people than literally any other country in the world.
By far, right? Statistically,
by far.
What are we? 25% of the global population, and
around that, yeah.
And the incarceration proportionality in our country is 80% or something almost unbelievable. That statistic may not be correct.
Yeah, I mean, we make up the majority of the world's prison population, hands down. And the degree of which we can find in the numbers, but the reality is there that more than many other countries, even countries that are bigger than ours, and have bigger populations.
Right.
So I do think that there's we have to be really, really specific about what we mean when we're saying that we want to dream of a world without police and prisons. Because for me, what that means is, when I go back to the law enforcement thing, they're like, someone has to enforce the laws, but also a lot of the laws in this country are not actually, like I said, meant to protect humans, they're meant to protect property. So what would it look like if communities actually got to decide as communities, what would it be like for us to enforce the agreements that we have in our communities, right? And what
Right.
are the things, and how can we think about sharing space with people without necessarily criminalizing their behaviors, right? And so it's just like, if someone's walking down the street and you don't know them, and they might be homeless and they are living out of their car, and you see this car parked and you're in your mind and you're like, what's happening, and you're assuming that there's negative intent because you're like, oh well, that person doesn't belong here, this thing doesn't belong here, this car doesn't belong here. But what you're doing is you're subconsciously criminalizing somebody's behavior, in which they're trying to do just to survive, right? And so, right now in Minneapolis, this is really big for our community because we have a really, really big houseless community that is, especially since the rebellions and the uprisings around George Floyd's murder, that has also been something that's been really uplifted, is that we have a lot of people in our community that are without homes. And we have a lot of parks in our city. So people have tried to create these kind of encampments to have people stay safe and, be able to get their needs, get food, supplies, and things like that. And lots of people have been very bothered that they have to, they lost their park view and now they have to see camps of folks. And, some of the excuses people say is like, well, there's been violence there and there's been harassment there. And it's like, yeah, because these folks are still actually not getting their needs met. So of course, we're in the middle of a global pandemic where so many people have lost their jobs. We have a place where people have lost their homes, where they don't have health care, where they're at risk for these very real things. And those are the things that cause violence. So if we're not actually, like, everybody deserves those things. Health care and housing is a human right, right? And so if we are actually orienting our communities around making sure that our neighbors, whether we know them or not, whether they share identities with us or not, are having the basic needs met, then we get to collaborate to figure out how we create our communities in the ways we want to see them.
Hearing you talk about it, it doesn't sound far-fetched. Hearing you talk about it, it doesn't sound fantastical. And actually, if I could take it one step further, to hear you break it apart, it sounds like the only thing to do. And I would like to offer that potentially it seems that there are forces that do everything in their power to keep people frightened from not seeing this very possible, very near reality. And I'm curious about your feelings, how the rebellions swelled up in this country during a period where, quote unquote, normal people had their liberties withheld. And there was a bit of a tantrum state. Psychologically, people were stressed, they were angry, they didn't know what was going on. And it spilled over. And it's very easy, and I've watched, as I'm sure you have, the media kind of shift it towards one perspective. But in reality, it was a huge connection and gathering of people coming together and saying, this will not work. And I'm sharing it because I think there's so much potential in this moment, in this movement, for us to continue to find ways to connect. And in the connection, make real big changes.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that, I think it was so interesting to be particularly in a state where in the kind of like urban centers, folks were, had really different reactions than folks in the rest of the state. And for me, this argument about civil liberties has been really difficult because I think about so many people who, Black people, women, queer people, trans people, who have to live in denial of those liberties every day.
That's right.
And this idea of, oh wow, you feel like you don't have freedom of movement in your own community. That's how I feel every day. That's how, we have multiple kind of like pandemics, if you will, happening, right? We also have these super high murders of trans women of color. And I think about just like the literal fear and survival mode that trans women, particularly Black and Latina trans women, are having to go through every day. And for someone to say that is comparable to not being able to get a haircut when they want, right?
That's right.
And so part of it, I think, is about American exceptionalism. We're all taught that our country can somehow be immune to the ills of the world, which is just not true. And no matter who you are, as someone who, you know, for me, as someone who's born and raised in this country, you know, there are ways that I'm always implicit in it, even though I don't benefit from it largely, right? But there are ways that, in comparison to my comrades in other countries, I absolutely benefit from it. So, yeah, I think that can be really, really hard because we have this part of the other thing that we're taught, along with the fear that you mentioned, is kind of like this: everybody should be treated the same, this kind of like neutrality. But the reality is that we all have really different experiences, and our positionality impacts like how we go through the world. And so when we have these kind of like one size fits all accommodations, we're always missing people. And I think that is also something that I think like, you know, white America and America that has class privilege and able-bodied and cisgender America is wrestling with, of these one size fits all, like basically people who are left out are saying, you can't leave me out anymore. And that can feel really threatening. And I think oftentimes people assume that, think of it in a really binary way. You're either like oppressed or you're not. And so like, if these people decide that they are no longer going to be oppressed, then that means that I must soon be on my way to being oppressed.
Right, of course.
And that binary is like super dangerous. So I think there is this fear that we know that this country doesn't treat Black and brown people well, and are afraid that Black and brown people want revenge for that. But the reality is that Black and brown people just want equality. They want equity. They want to be able to have justice and the same things that other people are afforded, and not revenge. And so there is something, and I think that's that spiritual impact that I was speaking to.
Yes.
I think people are afraid of like this, like, because it is so deeply, has deep spiritual implications, that anger, that fear will manifest into some type of revenge. And I think that is the inability to confront. I don't think that's actually because people are out to switch the conditions in that way. I know I certainly am not, but I also know that these institutions that are built were not served for the people that I'm in community with. So I am very clear that if I live in a world where Black trans women are protected, then I believe that everybody else in the world will also have their needs met, because the things that disenfranchise those folks the most are these systems of domination, racism, like anti-Blackness specifically, you know, cis hetero patriarchy, right? Like these ideas, these frameworks of how the world should be. When we address those things, I think that everybody gets to live in a safer world.
I agree. I feel like we could talk for hours. There's so many other things that I'd love to get into. I want to be mindful of the time now. I'm curious, maybe we could close out with this. I'm curious, talking about all that we're talking about all these movements and moments, how they involve so much intersectionality and so many different experiences are happening. People may be moving beyond the gaze of oppressor and oppressed, and more a deeper sense of unification and a real power and energy in that potential unification. Hearing us talk about it, I am struck with hope and gratitude that perhaps as brutal and violent and oppressive as it has been and may continue to be, at least these conversations that we're having personally, collectively, constantly, are moving us towards more a sense of awakened awareness. And in the end, that only serves all of us. Would you agree?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that, you know, I really appreciate that you uplifted the kind of like, you know, can we have hope despite how painful and how violent this past is? And I think we start by acknowledging that, you know, and I think that that's something that our country is still having a really hard time with.
That's
is
right.
figuring out how to admit, because we are socialized in a place that says, okay, we must be able to fix it immediately. And if you
Right.
can't imagine how to fix it, then we can't acknowledge that the
Mm.
James says this amazing quote that I love, that's like, not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed without being faced.
Amen.
And so I think it starts right there, right? Of this like deeply acknowledging that, to live in a world, if you are someone who has been benefiting from these systems, whether you consciously understand it or not, like it's going to feel uncomfortable and different to not be,
Hmm. Hmm.
and able to that and to build the resilience sitting with that. And
Hmm.
I think for me, mindfulness practice has been the tool that I've learned to be able to sit with that.
Yes.
Um,
Same.
and that right, and that discomfort allows us to actually transform. And
Mm.
I think we're in that place right now. But I have hope that when we commit to actually being transformed in the service of the work, that we actually get to live into the things that we want to see. And I think we're already doing those things. Like you said, like having these conversations individually, collectively, everybody has a place, everybody has a role. And if we are realizing the ways that I think we are already enacting abolitionist futures, then it starts not to be so scary, right? So every time we live in a place that has mutual aid and people are being able to share their skills and their resources with each other, that's not about commodification or profit, that's
Yeah.
living into an abolitionist future. Every time we figure out how to hold somebody accountable without throwing them out of our community, that's an abolitionist future, right? Like
Hmm.
there are lots of ways that we can already do that right
Hmm.
now. And knowing that we might not see the fruits of our labors in our lifetime, but knowing that like there's a legacy of people who have been fighting for something that they could not see right in front of them. And that is ultimately what gives me hope, to know that I'm standing on the shoulders of lots of people who have fought for this, whether they can see it or not. And it gives me hope that there's a radical potential of the future.
Definitely agree. Shoulder to shoulder and hand in hand. Thank you so much, Key. We'll put links and all the other information so you can follow what they're doing. And I really appreciate the time. It seems that if we can continue to turn our attention towards the truth of suffering and the shared experience that we are all suffering, the wisdom of motivation to turn into that and to make change is readily at hand.
Absolutely,
And
absolutely.
I'm really honored with this time. So thank you very much.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Bye,
Take
everybody.
care.
Wait, I did that wrong. I do